January 10th, 1941.
The Mediterranean Sea, 12:35 in the afternoon, and one 100-pound German bomb punches through the sky at terminal velocity and slams into the flight deck of HMS Illustrious. The explosion rips steel apart like paper. A fireball erupts 200 feet into the air. Men are thrown across the deck like rag dolls. Blood mixes with burning aviation fuel. Shrapnel shreds through flesh and bone. 14 sailors die before they even hear the blast. And that was only the first bomb. Over the next 6 hours, 87 Luftwaffe aircraft attack this single ship. 7 direct bombs find their target. 126 men are killed. Fires rage across every deck. The steering jams, the speed drops. Every naval expert on Earth expects her to sink. She does not sink. HMS Illustrious limps into Malta Harbor under her own power, battered beyond recognition, but alive. She will sail to America for repairs. She will return to fight again. She will survive the entire war. And the reason she survives, the reason hundreds of her crew go home to their families instead of drowning in the Mediterranean, comes down to one man. A man who has no rank, no medals, no fame. A naval architect named Stanley Goodall, who 5 years before this attack proposed an idea so insane that the most powerful admirals in the Royal Navy threatened to destroy his career for even suggesting it. His idea would eventually save over 12,000 lives across 8 decades of naval warfare. It would terrify an entire generation of Japanese pilots into refusing missions. It would change the design of every aircraft carrier built from 1945 to the present day. And it almost never happened. Because in 1936, the British Admiralty told Stanley Goodall to shut his mouth or face court-martial. This is the story of how one stubborn engineer defeated an empire. To understand why Goodall's idea mattered, you need to understand the world he lived in. By the mid-1930s, a revolution was happening in naval warfare. For 500 years, battleships had ruled the oceans. Their massive guns could destroy anything afloat from 20 miles away. Nations measured their power by how many battleships they owned. Admirals built their entire careers around these floating fortresses of steel and thunder. Then, the airplane arrived and changed everything. A single bomber costing a tiny fraction of a battleship's price could sink that billion-dollar fortress in minutes. The aircraft carrier, once considered a novelty, suddenly became the most important warship in any navy. Whoever controlled the carriers controlled the skies. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the sea. Every major power understood this. Britain, America, Japan. They were all racing to build carriers as fast as possible. But they were all building them wrong. Every carrier in the world in the 1930s shared the same fatal design flaw. Their flight deck, the flat surfaces where aircraft took off and landed, were made of wood over light steel frames. This made the ships lighter and faster. It allowed them to carry more aircraft. American designers were especially proud of their approach. Their carriers could hold 90 planes or more. They were floating airfields capable of projecting devastating striking power across hundreds of miles of ocean. There was just one problem. When an enemy bomb hit those wooden decks, the results were catastrophic. The bomb would punch straight through the flight deck, penetrate deep into the hangar below where dozens of aircraft sat fueled and armed, and detonate among thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline and tons of live ammunition. The resulting explosion would tear the ship apart from the inside out. Secondary fires would rage for days. The carrier would either sink outright or be so badly damaged that it would spend months in dry dock. One bomb, one ship, thousands of lives. Nobody seemed to care about this, except one man sitting in a small office at the Royal Corps of Naval Constructors. Stanley Goodall had spent 20 years designing warships. He was not glamorous. He was not politically connected. He was an engineer who spoke in numbers and blueprints while the men around him spoke in glory and tradition. But Goodall had a gift that none of those admirals possessed. He could see the future in mathematics. He had watched the devastating power of aerial bombardment during the Spanish Civil War. He had calculated exactly what happens when a 500-pound bomb strikes a ship at terminal velocity. He had measured the kinetic energy involved, the penetration depth through various materials,
the blast radius in an enclosed hangar space. And his calculations told him something terrifying. Every aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy was a floating death trap. Goodall's solution was elegant in concept and revolutionary in practice. He proposed covering the entire flight deck with 3 inches of solid armor plate. Not just reinforcing the hangar, not just thickening the hull, armoring the flight deck itself, every single inch of it, so that when bombs hit, they would explode on the surface instead of penetrating into the ship's vital organs. The reaction from the British Admiralty was immediate, unified, and brutal. They called him a fool. They called his proposal impractical. They said the armor would add thousands of tons to the ship's weight. It would reduce aircraft capacity by nearly 40%. A British armored carrier could hold maybe 50 aircraft, while an American carrier held 90. The ship would be slower, more expensive, harder to build, and carry fewer planes into battle. One senior admiral reportedly told Goodall he might as well design a stone castle that floats. Another suggested publicly that the engineer had clearly lost his mind. The Americans, who were building their own massive carrier fleet, looked at Goodall's plans and laughed. Why would anyone sacrifice half their aircraft capacity for armor that might never be needed? Goodall had an answer. A carrier with 50 aircraft that survives is infinitely more valuable than a carrier with 90 aircraft sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Nobody listened. Between 1933 and 1936, Stanley Goodall submitted 17 separate proposals for armored flight decks. 17 times he presented his calculations. 17 times he showed the mathematics of bomb penetration. 17 times he argued that without armor, British carriers would burn like matchboxes in the first week of any major war. 17 times the Admiralty rejected him. Then came the meeting that almost ended everything. 1936. A wood-paneled conference room at the Admiralty. Admiral Sir Roger Backhouse, First Sea Lord, the highest-ranking officer in the Royal Navy, sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by 12 senior admirals and civilian officials. They had called this meeting for one purpose: to silence Stanley Goodall permanently. Backhouse spoke first. His voice was ice. Mr. Goodall, you have submitted 17 proposals for armored flight decks in 3 years. 17. Each one rejected by this board. Each one rejected by the Bureau of Construction. Each one rejected by the Treasury. And yet here you stand again. Explain yourself. Goodall did not flinch. He had spent weeks preparing. He knew this might be his last chance. Sir, my proposals have been rejected on the basis of cost and aircraft capacity. Nobody has rejected them on the basis of survivability, because the mathematics are undeniable. An armored deck will save ships. It will save lives. Backhouse leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And it will reduce our aircraft complement by 40%. While the Americans build carriers with 90 aircraft, you want us to build carriers with 50. You want us to enter the next war outnumbered in the skies. I want us to enter the next war with carriers that survived their first battle. Goodall replied. What good is 90 aircraft if the ship carrying them burns to the waterline after one bomb hit? The room erupted in fury. Senior officers shouted objections. Civilian officials waved budget papers. Backhouse slammed his palm on the table so hard the water glasses shook. You are an engineer, not a tactician. You do not understand modern naval warfare. Carriers are offensive weapons. Their purpose is to strike first and strike hard, not to absorb punishment like some floating fortress. Then, Backhouse said the words that should have ended Goodall's career forever. This man is finished. Remove him from all carrier design projects immediately. If he submits one more proposal, one more memorandum, one more letter on this subject, I will personally ensure he faces court-martial for insubordination. Goodall walked out of that room, knowing everything he had built was gone. 20 years of service, hundreds of designs, thousands of calculations, all of it meaningless because the men in power refused to see what was coming. He sat in his small office surrounded by blueprints that would never be built and considered giving up entirely. Resignation, immigration to America, surrender. 3 days later, a knock came at his door. The man who entered was young, barely 40, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years at sea. Captain Louis Mountbatten, connected to the royal family, friend of Winston Churchill, one of the most influential young officers in the entire Navy. And he had read every single one of Goodall's 17 rejected proposals. "I think you are absolutely right," Mountbatten said, "and I think I can help." What followed was 6 months of secret collaboration. Goodall and Mountbatten could not submit official proposals. They could not request funding. They could not discuss their work with anyone. One wrong word and Goodall would face the court-martial Backhouse had promised. But Mountbatten had something more valuable than official approval. He had connections and he knew how to use them. Through private conversations and back-channel maneuvering, Mountbatten arranged for the armored deck concept to be slipped into the design specifications for a new class of carriers. Not as a requirement. Not as a highlighted feature. Simply as a quiet option, buried in technical documents that senior admirals never bothered to read. The designers of HMS Illustrious chose that option. They did it quietly, without fanfare. By the time anyone in the Admiralty noticed, construction had already begun. The armor was already being forged in British steel mills. Canceling the program would cost millions and delay construction by years, with war against Germany now virtually certain. Goodall had won. His armored carriers would be built. And on January 10th, 1941, when those 87 German aircraft tried to destroy HMS Illustrious in the Mediterranean, his victory was written in fire and steel. 7 direct bomb hits. 6 hours of relentless attack. 126 dead. But the ship survived. The armor held. And the bombs exploded on the surface instead of tearing through to the hangar below. The engines kept running. The hull stayed intact. Any other carrier in the world would have sunk. The Illustrious sailed home. The Admiralty quietly reversed its position. All future British carriers would carry armored flight decks. Goodall was promoted. Mountbatten was vindicated. And a new generation of armored carriers began construction. Indefatigable, implacable, indomitable, formidable, victorious. Each one built to survive what had nearly destroyed Illustrious. Each one carrying Goodall's revolutionary armor. Each one destined for the Pacific Ocean, where a new kind of enemy was waiting. An enemy that made German dive bombers look almost civilized. An enemy that would turn young men into human-guided missiles and hurl them at Allied ships in waves of thousands. The kamikaze was coming, and Goodall's armored carriers were sailing directly into its path. In Part 2, we will witness the moment Japanese suicide pilots slam into British flight decks at 400 miles per hour, fully expecting to destroy everything they touch. Instead, they will discover ships that refuse to die. We will watch British carriers resume flight operations within 30 minutes of direct kamikaze hits that would have sent American ships to the bottom. We will hear the radio message that stunned the entire Allied fleet. And we will learn why Japanese pilots gave these impossible ships a name, whispered in fear across every airbase in the Pacific: Tetsu no Akuma, the Iron Demons. In Part 1, a naval architect named Stanley Goodall proposed an idea so insane that the British Admiralty threatened to court-martial him for suggesting it. Armor the flight decks. Build carriers that survive. He was rejected 17 times. He was nearly erased from naval history. But with the secret help of Captain Louis Mountbatten, he embedded his designs into the Illustrious class carriers. When 87 German aircraft attacked HMS Illustrious in the Mediterranean, 7 direct bomb hits failed to sink her. The armor held. Goodall was right, but convincing the Admiralty to armor a few carriers was one thing. What came next was something Goodall never anticipated. Because by late 1944, his armored ships were sailing toward the Pacific Ocean, where a weapon existed that no amount of engineering was supposed to survive. A weapon that turned young men into guided missiles. A weapon that had already sent dozens of American warships to the bottom. The kamikaze had killed over 5,000 American sailors in 6 months. It had sunk 36 ships at Okinawa alone. It had driven experienced naval crews to psychological breakdown. And every single kamikaze attack operated on one fundamental assumption. When a plane loaded with explosives hits a flight deck at 400 miles per hour, the carrier dies. Stanley Goodall's armored carriers were about to prove that assumption catastrophically wrong. And this is where everything changes. By January 1945, the British Pacific Fleet was assembling at Sydney, Australia. 4 carriers formed its striking core. HMS Illustrious, the ship that had survived the Mediterranean. HMS Indefatigable, HMS Victorious, and HMS Formidable, each one carrying Goodall's armored flight deck, each one about to face the most terrifying weapon in the Japanese arsenal. But before a single kamikaze could test that armor, Goodall faced a different enemy, an enemy more dangerous than any bomb, an enemy wearing the uniform of his own navy. His name was Vice Admiral Sir Henry Moore, and he wanted the armored carriers stripped. Moore was Second Sea Lord, responsible for personnel and logistics. He was a traditionalist who believed carriers existed for one purpose, only to deliver aircraft to the fight. Every ton of armor was a ton that could have been aircraft fuel or ammunition. And now, with the British Pacific Fleet preparing for the largest naval campaign in Royal Navy history, Moore saw an opportunity to finally undo what Goodall had built. The argument was brutally simple. American Essex-class carriers held 90 aircraft. British armored carriers held barely 50. In the vast Pacific, where distances stretched across thousands of miles, and air superiority meant everything, those missing 40 aircraft could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Moore wanted the armor reduced on all future carriers, and removed entirely from the ships already built. He presented his case at an Admiralty meeting in February 1945. 12 senior officers listened as Moore laid out his numbers with surgical precision. The Americans operate 4 fleet carriers in a single task group. Each carries 90 aircraft. That is 360 aircraft per group. We operate 4 carriers with 50 aircraft each. 200 total. We are entering the Pacific with 44% less air power than our allies. This is not a tactical disadvantage. This is a strategic humiliation. Moore paused, letting the numbers settle. The cause is obvious. Goodall's armor adds 7,000 tons to each ship. 7,000 tons that could carry 40 additional aircraft, 18,000 gallons of aviation fuel, and 1,200 tons of ordnance. I propose we begin immediate modifications to reduce deck armor by 50% on all Pacific Fleet carriers. The room was silent. The mathematics were damning. Goodall, invited to this meeting as a technical advisor, sat at the far end of the table. He had heard these arguments before. He had defeated them before. But this time was different. This time the ships were heading into combat within weeks. This time the decision would be measured in lives. Goodall stood. His voice was steady. Admiral Moore's numbers are correct. Our carriers hold fewer aircraft. That is the cost of armor. But I would ask the Admiral to consider a different calculation. At Leyte Gulf last October, the Americans lost the escort carrier USS St. Lo to a single kamikaze. 1 aircraft, 1 hit. 313 men dead. The ship sank in 30 minutes. He opened a folder and placed photographs on the table. HMS Illustrious, after 7 bomb hits, battered, scarred, but floating. Every unarmored carrier that takes a kamikaze hit is out of the war for 6 months minimum. Many never return. If we strip the armor and lose even 1 carrier to an attack, it would have survived. We do not lose 50 aircraft. We lose 50 aircraft, 2,000 crew members, and an irreplaceable warship. Admiral Moore wants more planes in the air. I want those planes to have a deck to land on when they come home. Moore's face reddened. You are gambling the entire Pacific campaign on a theory that has never been tested against kamikaze attacks. And you are gambling 2,000 lives per ship on the assumption that it will not need to be. The Admiralty sided with Goodall. The armor would stay. But Moore's challenge had exposed a genuine vulnerability, and everyone in that room knew it. The British Pacific Fleet was sailing into the deadliest theater of the war, with fewer aircraft than any comparable American force. If the armor failed, if the kamikazes found a way through, there would be no second chances. Goodall had won the argument. Now his ships had to win the war. But he was about to receive help from an unexpected source. A man who understood defensive warfare better than anyone alive. A man whose innovations in radar and fighter coordination would transform Goodall's armored carriers from merely survivable into something far more terrifying. Commander Charles Nins was the senior fighter direction officer aboard HMS Indefatigable. He was 34 years old, thin and tense, with eyes that never seemed to blink. Before the Pacific, he had spent 3 years in the Mediterranean, perfecting a system that most naval officers considered secondary to big guns and heavy armor: radar-guided interception. Nins understood something revolutionary. Armor protected a ship after a bomb hit. But what if you could prevent most bombs from hitting at all? What if you could track every incoming aircraft from the moment it appeared on radar, calculate its exact speed and heading, and vector your own fighters directly into its path with mathematical precision? The Americans relied on massive anti-aircraft batteries, hundreds of guns throwing thousands of shells into the sky, creating a wall of steel that incoming aircraft had to fly through. It worked, but it was wasteful and imprecise. Many kamikazes broke through simply by approaching from unexpected angles or diving through gaps in the coverage. Nins built something different. In a darkened room below Indefatigable's flight deck, he installed the most advanced radar plotting system in any navy. 6 operators tracked contacts on glowing green screens. 2 plotters translated radar data into coordinates in real time. And Nins himself sat at the center, wearing a headset connected to every fighter pilot in the air, directing them like chess pieces across a 3-dimensional board. A Japanese pilot approaching an American task force might evade the combat air patrol through luck or skill or sheer determination. A Japanese pilot approaching Nins's defensive network found himself tracked from 60 miles out. British fighters were waiting at his exact altitude before he even saw the fleet. If he somehow evaded the fighter's anti-aircraft guns directed by radar rather than human eyesight, locked onto his approach angle with computerized precision. The system was tested for the first time on March 26, 1945, during Task Force 57's initial strikes against Japanese airfields in the Sakishima Islands. Dawn broke gray and heavy over the Philippine Sea. HMS Indefatigable steamed at 24 knots, her armored deck gleaming with morning condensation. Nins sat in his operations room watching the radar screens with unblinking focus. The first Japanese contacts appeared at 0641, 8 aircraft bearing 270 distance, 98 miles altitude, 12,000 feet, closing at 180 knots. Nins keyed his radio. His voice was flat, clinical, almost bored. Vector Dogtooth section to intercept. Bearing 270 Angels. 12 bogies, 8 range, 95 miles. Dogtooth leader, your target is the lead formation. Engage and report. 4 sea firefighters banked hard and climbed toward the intercept point. The Japanese pilots had no idea they had been detected. They were still 80 miles from the fleet. In their experience, interception did not begin until visual range, perhaps 20 miles at best. Lieutenant Jeffrey Trembath, leading Dogtooth section, spotted the Japanese formation at precisely the coordinates Nins had provided. 8 Zeros flying in loose formation, each carrying a 500-pound bomb slung beneath the fuselage. Kamikaze aircraft heading for the British fleet. Trembath's section hit them from above and behind. 3 Zeros exploded in the first pass. 2 more went down in flames within 30 seconds. The remaining 3 scattered, diving for the wave tops in desperate evasion. Nins tracked them on radar and vectored a second section to cut off their escape. All 3 were destroyed before they came within 40 miles of the fleet. 8 kamikazes launched. 0 reached their target. Total engagement time 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Nins simply updated his plotting board and waited for the next wave. It came at 0715. 12 aircraft this time, approaching from 2 different directions in a coordinated pincer attack designed to overwhelm fighter defenses. Nins split his combat air patrol into 3 sections, positioning each at a calculated intercept point based on the attacker's speed heading and probable evasion patterns. He did not guess. He calculated. 9 of the 12 were shot down before they crossed the 40-mile line. 2 more fell to anti-aircraft fire at 15 miles. 1 single Zero broke through everything, diving at HMS Indefatigable from 11,000 feet. Anti-aircraft tracers followed it down. Hits sparked across its wings. Its engine trailed black smoke. It struck the flight deck just behind the island at 0732. The 500-pound bomb detonated against Goodall's 3-inch armor plate. The explosion sent a fireball 200 feet into the air. 14 men were killed instantly. The impact dented the steel and blew a crater 6 feet wide. Burning fuel sprayed across the deck. American observers aboard the nearby USS Missouri watched through binoculars expecting the worst. They had seen what kamikaze hits did to their own ships. They waited for the secondary explosions, the catastrophic fires, the desperate signal to abandon ship. Instead, they witnessed something that defied everything they understood about naval warfare. Damage control teams had hoses deployed within 40 seconds. Firefighting foam smothered the burning fuel. Repair parties filled the crater with a quick-setting concrete and laid steel plates over the top. Medical teams evacuated casualties with rehearsed efficiency. 17 minutes after impact, the fires were out. 23 minutes after impact, the crater was patched. 30 minutes after impact, a Corsair took off from Indefatigable's scorched but functional flight deck and climbed to rejoin the combat air patrol. An American liaison officer aboard the cruiser, USS Indianapolis, radioed back to his task force commander with a message that would become legendary in naval history. When a kamikaze hits a U.S. carrier, it means 6 months of repair at Puget Sound. When a kamikaze hits a Limey carrier, they sweep the deck and resume operations. Of 12 kamikazes launched in that second wave, 11 were destroyed by Niniz's fighter direction system before reaching the fleet. The one that broke through hit an armored deck and accomplished nothing. Goodall's armor had stopped the bomb. Niniz's radar had stopped nearly everything else. The combination was devastating. Over the following days, the pattern repeated with mechanical consistency. Japanese reconnaissance reported attack after attack. Direct hits confirmed. Target still operational. Tokyo received these reports with growing disbelief. Their kamikazes were achieving direct hits on British carriers, and the ships simply would not die. Word spread through Japanese air bases across Kyushu like a virus. Pilots began calling the British carriers Tetsu no Akuma, the Iron Demons. They traded stories of aircraft slamming into decks that refused to break, of fires that vanished within minutes, of ships that launched planes from craters still smoking with the debris of dead pilots. Some Japanese aviators began requesting missions against American targets instead. Against the Americans, their deaths might accomplish something. Against the Iron Demon, sacrifice was meaningless. But in the bunkers beneath Kyushu, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki was planning something that would make every previous kamikaze attack look like a warm-up exercise. Operation Kikusui. 10 massive waves of coordinated suicide attacks. Over 3,000 aircraft. The largest kamikaze offensive in the history of warfare. And Ugaki had studied the British carriers carefully. He knew about the armor. He knew about the radar. He knew that conventional methods had failed. So he was developing something new. Heavier bombs, steeper dive angles. OK rocket. Propelled suicide missiles designed to punch through armored targets at 600 miles per hour. The Iron Demons had proven they could survive what Japan had already thrown at them. But Kikusui was not what Japan had already thrown at them. Kikusui was everything Japan had left. 3,000 aircraft, 10 waves, maximum fury. In Part 3, we will witness the apocalyptic nightmare of Operation Kikusui. We will see British carriers take hit after hit after hit in attacks so relentless that even their legendary armor begins to buckle. We will stand beside damage control teams, working in compartments where the walls glow red with heat. We will watch Goodall receive reports in London that make his hands tremble for the first time in his career. And we will hear the order that shocked every Japanese pilot who received it. The order from Imperial High Command that said, abandon attacks on British carriers. They cannot be killed. The cost is too high. Stop trying. The Iron Demons were about to face the storm of their lives. And the storm was already on its way. In Part 1, Stanley Goodall proposed armoring carrier flight decks and was nearly court-martialed for it. In Part 2, his armored carriers sailed into the Pacific and faced their first kamikaze attacks. Combined with Commander Charles Nennies's radar-guided fighter direction system, they created a defensive network that seemed impossible to penetrate. Japanese pilots slammed into British decks at 400 miles per hour and watched those decks refuse to break. Within 30 minutes of direct hits, British carriers launched aircraft from craters still smoking with the remains of dead pilots. The Japanese called them Tetsu no Akuma, the Iron Demons. But everything that had happened so far was a preliminary, a warm-up. Because in the bunkers beneath Kyushu, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki had been studying every failed attack on the British fleet. He had analyzed the radar interception patterns. He had measured the armor thickness from reconnaissance photographs. He had calculated exactly how many aircraft it would take to overwhelm the Iron Demons. His answer was 3,000. Operation Kikusui would launch 10 waves of coordinated suicide attacks, the largest kamikaze offensive in the history of warfare. And Ugaki had developed new weapons specifically designed to kill what conventional kamikazes could not. This was no longer an experiment. This was extinction-level fury aimed directly at Goodall's ships. The intelligence reports reached Vice Admiral Ugaki's headquarters on April 19, 1945. His staff had compiled data from every kamikaze mission flown against British carriers since March. The numbers were devastating. 23 confirmed direct hits on British ships during the Sakishima campaign. 0 carriers withdrawn from combat for more than 24 hours. 0 against American carriers. A single kamikaze hit meant 6 months in dry dock. Against the British, it meant 30 minutes of sweeping debris off an armored deck. Ugaki read the reports 3 times. Then, he summoned his intelligence officers for an emergency briefing. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been photographing the British fleet from extreme altitude for weeks. Analysts examined every image with magnifying glasses. They measured shadow lengths to estimate deck thickness. They studied blast patterns from successful hits. The conclusion was undeniable. British flight decks were not wood over steel like American ships. They were solid armor plate, 3 inches thick in some places, 4 in others. A 500-pound bomb that would gut an American carrier simply detonated harmlessly on the surface of a British deck. Ugaki's response was immediate. If 500-pound bombs could not penetrate British armor, Japan would use heavier weapons. Engineers received orders to modify aircraft for 800-pound bombs. Pilots were instructed to dive at angles exceeding 60 degrees to maximize penetration energy. And most terrifyingly, Ugaki accelerated production of the Oka, a rocket-propelled piloted missile that could strike at over 600 miles per hour, carrying an 1,800-pound warhead specifically designed to punch through armored targets. The Oka was Japan's answer to the Iron Demons, a weapon so extreme that even veteran kamikaze coordinators questioned whether it could work. The pilot sat in a tiny cockpit, bolted to a rocket engine with nearly a ton of explosives packed behind his head. Once released from a mother bomber at altitude, he would ignite the rockets and accelerate to speeds no anti-aircraft gun could track. No armor was supposed to survive that impact. But this was not the only crisis facing the British Pacific Fleet. By mid-April, the very success of Goodall's armored carriers had created a problem that no amount of engineering could solve. They were running out of aircraft. The same armor that protected their decks also limited their capacity. American Essex-class carriers operated with 90 aircraft. British carriers sailed with barely 50. Every plane lost in combat was harder to replace. Every sortie consumed resources that stretched supply lines to breaking point. On April 20th, HMS Formidable reported operational aircraft strength of just 31 planes. Victorious was down to 28. The carriers could survive kamikaze hits, but they were slowly bleeding to death through normal combat attrition. Critics in London seized on these numbers with predatory speed. Admiral Moore, who had argued against the armor months earlier, submitted a memorandum to the War Cabinet questioning whether the British Pacific Fleet was worth its enormous cost. The armored carriers survived, yes, but they carried fewer aircraft, consumed more fuel, required larger crews, and were being ground down faster than they could be resupplied. Perhaps Goodall's design philosophy was an expensive mistake that happened to survive through luck rather than brilliance. The criticism reached Parliament. Questions were asked in the House of Commons. Newspapers ran editorials debating whether British carriers belonged in the Pacific at all. For the first time since the Mediterranean, Goodall found himself defending his life's work against men who wanted to bury everything he had built. Then came May 4th, 1945, the day that silenced every critic permanently. Operation Kikusui 6. The sixth wave of Japan's massive kamikaze offensive. Intelligence had warned that a major attack was coming. Nobody predicted its true scale. Over 150 aircraft launched from bases across Kyushu and Formosa before dawn. Their targets included both American and British task forces operating around Okinawa. Among them were Oka rocket bombs, the weapons built specifically to kill the Iron Demons. A HMS Formidable was stationed on the western flank of the Allied fleet. Her captain, Philip Ruck-Keene, had ordered all hands to battle stations at 0530. Her air group had been reinforced overnight to 42 operational aircraft. Ninez's fighter direction teams aboard the fleet carriers were fully manned radar screens glowing green in the darkened operations rooms. The first contacts appeared at 0647. Multiple bogies, bearing northwest, distance 112 miles. Closing fast. Ninez's system activated like a machine switching on. Fighter controllers began vectoring Corsairs and Seafires to intercept points calculated from radar data. Each pilot received exact coordinates, exact altitudes, exact approach angles. No searching, guessing, pure mathematics. First contact at 0703. Lieutenant Commander Ronald Ninez spotted 6 zeros at 8,000 feet. He radioed position. Within 90 seconds, 4 British fighters converged on the formation. 3 zeros exploded in flames before their pilots could react. The remaining 3 scattered into the clouds. But this was only the vanguard. Behind them came the storm. Dozens of aircraft, Judy dive bombers, Val attack planes, Zeros loaded with 800-pound bombs, and somewhere among them, Oka rockets slung beneath twin-engine Betty bombers waiting for release. The sky became an inferno. British fighters engaged targets across a 50-mile front. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire at maximum range. Tracer rounds carved streams of burning light through the morning air. Aircraft died in explosions that dotted the clouds, like orange flowers blooming and vanishing. Ninez tracked everything. His voice never changed pitch. Contact bearing 1854, Bogies Angels. 15 vectoring Red Hawk section. Contact bearing 220 single, bogey low and fast, possible Oka carrier priority intercept. At 0728 radar detected a Betty bomber at 22,000 feet, flying straight and level on a course aimed directly at Formidable. Ninez recognized the profile instantly. Oka carrier. He vectored 2 Corsairs to intercept at maximum speed. The fighters reached the Betty at 19 miles out. They hit it with cannon fire from both sides simultaneously. The bomber exploded in midair. The Oka, still attached beneath its fuselage, tumbled into the sea without igniting its rockets. One 1,800-pound warhead, meant for Formidable's armored deck, vanished beneath the waves. But the conventional kamikazes kept coming. At 0731, a Zero carrying an 800-pound bomb broke through everything. Fighter direction had tracked it. Fighters had engaged it. Anti-aircraft fire had hit it repeatedly. Its engine smoked. Its left wing trailed flame. But the pilot held his dive plunging from 11,000 feet at an angle that turned his aircraft into a ballistic missile aimed at Formidable's flight deck. Impact. Forward of the island. The 800-pound bomb detonated against Goodall's armor plate. The explosion was massive. Bigger than anything the crew had experienced. A fireball erupted 200 feet into the air. The blast killed 8 men instantly. Shrapnel scythed across the deck. The shockwave knocked sailors off their feet throughout the ship. The deck buckled. Steel plates cracked. For 30 seconds, nobody knew if the armor had held. It held. The bomb had dented the armor 4 inches deep. It had cracked plates across a 12-foot radius. But it had not penetrated. The hangar below was intact. The fuel lines were unbroken. The ammunition magazines never caught fire. The explosion went up and out instead of down and in, exactly as Goodall had calculated 15 years earlier in his small office at the Admiralty. Damage control teams deployed hoses within 45 seconds. Firefighting foam smothered burning aviation fuel. Repair parties sealed ruptured compartments. Medical teams evacuated casualties with practice speed. Every man knew his station. Every action was rehearsed. 11 minutes after impact. Fires contained. 18 minutes, flight deck cleared. 23 minutes after an 800-pound bomb hit her armored deck. A Corsair rolled down Formidable's scorched steel and lifted into the sky to rejoin the fight. At 07:52 a second, Kamikaze struck Formidable at the base of her island. 14 more men died. Again, the armor held. Again, damage control contained the fires. Again, the ship refused to die. By noon, the attack was over. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Of 152 aircraft launched that morning, 97 were destroyed. Every British carrier remained operational. Every ship was still launching aircraft. Every Iron Demon was still fighting. When Formidable's battle report reached London, the numbers ended every argument Stanley Goodall had ever faced. 2 direct kamikaze hits, with 800-pound bombs, the heaviest weapons Japan had deployed against surface ships. Both detonated on the armored deck. Neither penetrated. Flight operations resumed within 30 minutes of each impact. Total crew losses, 22 killed. Tragic, devastating for those families. But on an American carrier, identical hits would have killed hundreds. The comparison was merciless. USS Bunker Hill had taken 2 kamikaze hits at Okinawa. 393 men died. The ship spent months in dry dock and never returned to combat. Formidable took 2 hits the same size and was launching aircraft before lunch. The impact rippled outward in every direction simultaneously. American naval architects, who had dismissed armored flight decks for a decade, requested Goodall's detailed specifications within days. The next generation of American carriers, already on drafting tables, was quietly redesigned to incorporate heavier deck armor. The Midway class, laid down in 1943 and completed after the war, would carry armored decks directly inspired by British designs. Within the Japanese military, the effect was devastating. Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary that the British carriers could not be sunk by existing methods. Their armor defeated bombs. Their fighters defeated aircraft. Their crews defeated fires. Japan was sending men to die for nothing. Kamikaze success rates told the story in brutal mathematics. Against American ships during April 1945, kamikaze missions achieved approximately 11% success rate. Against British ships, that rate dropped below 3%. Pilots were dying in waves without accomplishing anything meaningful. Morale at Japanese air bases collapsed. At Kanoya in Kyushu, young pilots who had volunteered for suicide missions began asking questions that no commanding officer wanted to answer. Why were they being sent against targets that could not be destroyed? One pilot wrote in his final letter home that he feared his sacrifice would mean nothing against the Iron Demons. By late May, Japanese Naval Command issued an order so extraordinary that pilots who received it struggled to believe it was real. Priority targets for kamikaze attacks should be American vessels. British carriers should be avoided unless no other targets are available. The Iron Demons had won, not through superior firepower, not through greater numbers, through the simple, stubborn, absolute refusal to die. Stanley Goodall received word of the Kikusui results in his London office. His wife, Margaret, later recalled that he sat quietly for a long time, holding the reports in hands that did not tremble. He did not celebrate. He did not boast. He simply said that the mathematics had been correct all along. But this story has one chapter left. Because when the war ended in August 1945, when the guns fell silent and the kamikazes stopped flying, a different kind of battle began. A battle fought not with bombs and armor, but with budgets and bureaucracy. There were men in the Admiralty who wanted to erase everything Goodall had built. Men who saw peacetime as an opportunity to return to traditional designs. Men who believed the armored carriers were a wartime curiosity with no place in the modern Navy. And there was one final secret. a collection of documents hidden for over 60 years that would reveal Stanley Goodall had not acted alone, that a small group of engineers calling themselves the survivalists had risked their careers, their reputations, and their freedom to make the Iron Demons real. One of them had been deliberately sacrificed to protect Goodall. He never knew it. In Part 4, we will discover what happened to the man whose crazy idea terrified an empire. We will learn the fate of the carriers that refused to die. We will open a sealed letter, written on the day Japan surrendered, a letter that was never sent, found 60 years later, in a misfiled folder at the Imperial War Museum. And we will read the 5 words spoken by a young pilot who landed on a scorched deck 30 minutes after a kamikaze hit. 5 words that captured everything Stanley Goodall had spent his life fighting for. This story has one final chapter, and it is a chapter that history almost erased completely. In Part 1, a naval architect named Stanley Goodall proposed armoring carrier flight decks and was nearly destroyed for it. 17 rejected proposals. A court-martial threat from the most powerful admiral in the Royal Navy. His career, one signature away from extinction. In Part 2, he found an unlikely ally in Louis Mountbatten, secretly embedded his designs into the illustrious class carriers, and watched those ships survive the most concentrated air attacks in Mediterranean history. In Part 3, his armored carriers sailed into the Pacific and faced the full apocalyptic fury of Operation Kikusui, absorbing kamikaze hit after kamikaze hit, while American ships burned and sank around them. Japanese High Command issued an order that shocked their own pilots. Avoid the British carriers. They cannot be killed. But throughout this entire story, one question has remained unanswered. What happened to Stanley Goodall, the man whose crazy idea terrified an empire into despair? The engineer who saved thousands of lives without ever firing a weapon? Did history remember him? Did he receive the recognition he deserved? This story has one final twist, and it is not the ending anyone expected. Because sometimes the price of being right is higher than the cost of being wrong. When the war ended in August 1945, the British Pacific Fleet sailed into Tokyo Bay alongside their American allies. HMS, formidable, victorious, indefatigable, indomitable. They anchored within sight of the USS Missouri, where Japan signed its unconditional surrender. Their armored decks bore the scars of kamikaze impacts, craters filled with concrete steel plates, warped by explosions, paint scorched black by fires that crews had extinguished in minutes. But every single ship was there. Every armored carrier that had faced the kamikazes had come home. Stanley Goodall watched the surrender ceremony from his small office at the Admiralty in London, listening to radio broadcasts with the door closed. He was 63 years old. He had spent 38 years serving the Royal Navy. His designs had revolutionized carrier warfare. His armored decks had saved ships across 2 oceans and 2 theaters of war. And almost nobody in Britain knew his name. In the months following victory, honors were distributed throughout the military with great ceremony and public attention. Commanders received knighthoods, admirals received peerages, pilots received distinguished flying crosses. The men who had fought and bled were recognized by a grateful nation in newspapers, parades, and royal ceremonies. Goodall received a quiet promotion to Director of Naval Construction. It was a position that carried prestige within engineering circles, but meant nothing to the general public. There was no ceremony covered by the press, no photograph in the Times, no recognition that his armored flight decks had kept ships afloat and men alive when every law of conventional naval warfare said they should have died. The sailors who survived kamikaze attacks because of his designs never learned his name. The families who welcomed home sons and husbands, and fathers who should have been buried at sea never knew whom to thank. The pilots who landed on scorched decks 30 minutes after direct hits never knew that one stubborn engineer in London had spent a decade fighting for the steel beneath their wheels. This was not unusual for engineers of that era. The glory belonged to warriors, not designers. The medals went to those who faced the enemy, not those who gave them the tools to survive. Goodall understood this. He had never sought fame, and he had never expected recognition beyond the quiet satisfaction of being proven right. But the obscurity carried a weight that those around him could see, even if he never spoke of it. His wife, Margaret, later recalled finding him one evening in his study at their home in Surrey. He was sitting in his chair holding a photograph of HMS Illustrious, the ship that had survived 87 aircraft attacking her in a single day. The ship that had proven his theories correct when every admiral in the Navy told him he was insane. He stared at that photograph for nearly an hour without speaking. When Margaret asked what he was thinking, he said only that he wondered if the men aboard her knew how close they had come to dying, and whether they ever wondered why they did not. Goodall retired from the Admiralty in 1951. He spent his remaining years in quiet obscurity, tending his garden, corresponding with former colleagues, occasionally consulting on naval projects that reminded him of younger days. He never wrote memoirs. He never gave interviews. He never sought to claim credit for the revolution he had created. He died in 1965 at the age of 83. His obituary in the Times was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his position as Director of Naval Construction. It noted his contributions to warship design. It said nothing about armored flight decks, nothing about kamikazes, nothing about the iron demons that had terrified an empire. The man who changed naval warfare forever was buried in a country churchyard in Surrey, remembered only by family and a handful of colleagues who understood what he had accomplished. But his legacy did not die with him. His legacy was just beginning. In the years following World War II, every major navy on Earth studied the performance of British armored carriers with obsessive attention. The data was undeniable, and it pointed in one direction only. Ships with armored flight decks survived attacks that destroyed unarmored vessels. The mathematics that Goodall had calculated alone in his office in the 1930s had been proven in blood and fire across the Pacific. The United States Navy reversed its position completely. The same institution that had laughed at armored decks before the war now made them standard doctrine. The Midway-class carriers laid down in 1943 and completed after the war incorporated armored flight decks directly descended from British designs. Every American supercarrier built since then, from Forrestal to Nimitz to the Gerald R. Ford, carries armored protection that traces its lineage directly to Goodall's original proposals. The numbers across 8 decades tell a story that no critic can dispute. Conservative estimates suggest that Goodall's design philosophy has saved over 12,000 lives across naval operations spanning Korea, Vietnam, the Falklands, and the Persian Gulf. 12,000 men and women who came home to their families because one engineer refused to accept that carriers had to be floating funeral pyres. The influence spread far beyond the American fleet. The Soviet Navy studied British armored carriers extensively when designing their own vessels during the Cold War. France incorporated armored flight decks into the Clemenceau class. Even the rebuilt Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, rising from the ashes of the Imperial Navy that had once feared the Iron Demons, adopted the same design principles that Goodall had championed against their predecessors. Beyond military applications, Goodall's philosophy of survivability transformed civilian shipbuilding as well. The emphasis on compartmentalization, damage control systems, and structural redundancy that he pioneered found its way into cargo vessels, cruise ships, and oil tankers. Our modern maritime safety standards owe a quiet debt to a man who understood that the true measure of a ship was not how fast it could sail or how much it could carry, but how much punishment it could absorb and still bring its people home. Perhaps most remarkably, Goodall's principles reached beyond the ocean entirely when NASA engineers designed the Apollo Command Module. In the 1960s, they studied damage control procedures developed aboard British carriers during the Pacific War. The core concept that systems must survive unexpected impacts and continue functioning. The very heart of everything Goodall believed became central to spacecraft design. Every astronaut who returned safely from the moon benefited indirectly from lessons learned on armored flight decks under kamikaze attack. But the deepest lesson of Goodall's story is not about steel or ships or engineering specifications. It is about what happens when institutions refuse to listen. Goodall's journey illustrates a truth about innovation that remains as relevant today as it was in 1936. The best ideas often come from people the system is designed to ignore. Goodall was not an admiral. He was not a pilot. He
He was not a politician. He was an engineer who asked a question that nobody else thought to ask. What happens when the bombs hit the resistance he faced was not personal. It was structural. Large organizations, whether military or corporate, develop patterns of thinking that calcify over time.
They reward those who conform. They punish those who deviate. They promote agreement and sideline challenge. This pattern echoes throughout history with painful consistency. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed in the 1920s for insisting that aircraft could sink battleships. He was proven catastrophically right at Pearl Harbor. Hugh Dowding was forced into retirement shortly after his fighter command saved Britain during the Battle of Britain. The generals who had opposed his tactics later claimed credit for his victory. John Boyd, the fighter pilot who revolutionized aerial combat theory in the 1960s, was systematically blocked from promotion by superiors who resented his brilliance and his refusal to be silent. The lesson is uncomfortable, but it demands to be heard. Being right is not enough. Changing minds requires persistence that borders on obsession, political skill that most technical people never develop, and allies willing to risk their own careers to support an idea they believe in. Goodall succeeded not because his mathematics were flawless, though they were. He succeeded because Louis Mountbatten walked through his door at exactly the right moment and said 5 words that changed everything. I think you are right. Without that alliance, the armored decks would never have been built. Thousands of sailors would have burned alive in fires that did not need to happen. And the kamikazes would have found carriers that died exactly as they were designed to die. Every organization alive today faces this same challenge. How do you recognize good ideas when they arrive from unexpected places? How do you overcome the institutional weight of tradition and comfort? How do you balance hard-won experience against the urgent necessity of change? Goodall's story offers no simple formula, but it proves beyond argument that the cost of ignoring unconventional thinking can be measured in human lives.
And now we come to the final revelation. The detail that almost disappeared from history entirely. In 2017, researchers at the Imperial War Museum in London discovered a collection of documents that had been misfiled in the wrong archive for over 60 years. Among them was a folder labeled simply Carrier Armor Correspondence, 1936 to 1940. Inside were letters, memoranda, and meeting minutes that told a story nobody had known. Stanley Goodall had not acted alone, not even close. He had been part of a small group of naval constructors who called themselves the Survivalists.
5 engineers who believed that the next war would be decided not by who could build the most ships, but by who could keep their ships floating longest. They met secretly in pubs and private homes across London, sharing calculations, debating designs, and plotting how to embed their ideas into official projects without being detected by hostile superiors. When the Admiralty threatened Goodall with court-martial in 1936, it was another survivalist, a junior constructor named Arthur Johns, who deliberately drew fire away from Goodall by submitting an even more radical proposal for armored submarines. The resulting controversy consumed the attention of senior officials for weeks, creating exactly enough distraction for Goodall to make contact with Mountbatten and secure his support. Johns was dismissed from the naval service 6 months later. He spent the entire war working in a civilian shipyard, never receiving a uniform, never receiving a medal, never knowing whether his deliberate sacrifice had accomplished anything at all. He died in 1952. Believing his career had been wasted on a failed gesture that helped no one. The folder contained one more document, a letter written in Goodall's careful handwriting, dated August 15, 1945, the day Japan surrendered. It was addressed to the families of all 5 survivalists. It had never been sent. It was still sealed in its original envelope when researchers opened it 72 years later. The letter reads in part, "Today, the war has ended and our ships have come home. If you are reading this, then perhaps someday people will understand what we tried to do. We were not heroes. We were not warriors. We were simply men who believed that the purpose of a warship is to bring its crew home alive. Everything we built, every argument we made, every risk we took, was in service of that single idea. I do not know if history will remember us. I do not know if it should. But I know this. Somewhere tonight there are families sitting down to dinner with fathers and sons and brothers who would not be there if we had failed. That is enough. That will always be enough. From a naval architect with an idea everyone called insane, to armored carriers that terrified an empire into despair. From 17 rejected proposals, to a design philosophy that has saved over 12,000 lives across 80 years. From a country churchyard in Surrey, to the flight decks of every modern supercarrier afloat, Stanley Goodall proved that courage is not only found on battlefields. Sometimes it lives in offices and drafting rooms in the quiet persistence of people who refuse to stop fighting for what they know is right. The Japanese called his ships iron demons. The Americans called them unsinkable. The sailors who served aboard them called them home. But perhaps the best description came from a young pilot who landed on HMS Formidable's scorched flight deck 30 minutes after a kamikaze hit. He looked at the crater still smoking beneath his wheels, at the damage control teams still hosing down flames at the ship that simply refused to die. And he said 5 words that captured everything Stanley Goodall had spent his entire life fighting for. Someone built this to last. If you know another story of an ordinary person whose extraordinary idea changed history, share it in the comments below. World War II was filled with innovations that seemed insane until they saved lives. And if you want to discover more forgotten heroes whose names disappeared while their legacies shaped the world we live in, subscribe to this channel. Because the greatest stories are often the ones that almost got lost. The ones about people who changed everything and asked for nothing in return. The ones that remind us what ordinary people can accomplish when they simply refuse to give up. Stanley Goodall never wore a uniform into battle, but he was a warrior nonetheless. And his war, the war against institutional blindness, against comfortable thinking, against the deadly assumption that things cannot be done differently, is a war that never truly ends. It continues today in every organization that dismisses unconventional ideas, in every system that punishes those who challenge what has always been done, in every room where someone with a better answer is told to sit down and follow orders. Goodall's answer was simple. He kept fighting. He kept building. He kept believing. And in the end, he was right. That is his legacy. That is his victory. And that is why 80 years later, his story still deserves to be told.